Article 9 of the Japanese Constitution renounces the state's sovereignty to wage war or use it as a means to solve international disputes. This means that they cannot maintain any land, sea, or air military presence. Their military presence is extremely limited. Their use of military equipment is extremely limited. Ladies and gentlemen, they can basically only use defensive, passive, retroactive force. This article was written in 1947 conditioned by the Allied forces, and since then has forever bound Japan's ability to protect itself and its citizens. Ladies and gentlemen, what's important in today's debate is the wording of the motion. This House would support. As a proposition, we tell you that we would only support this when it is done under the circumstances established in the Japanese Constitution to abolish such an act. Two things must happen. Firstly, there must be a 2/3 majority vote in Parliament that favours this abolition. And secondly, there must be a national referendum in which the majority of the people vote yes. We tell you three things today as the proposition. 1, this is principally legitimate. 2, this prevents harms that are currently faced by the Japanese. And 3, Alex is going to be talking to you about why this improves international superpower dynamics. So let's get on to my first point of positive matter, which is the principled argument. And here we tell you that we think it is principally legitimate and we value when any state can protect its citizens, but especially when that is exactly what those citizens want. Because of the nature of abolition of this article, because people actually have to buy into it and say to their government that they want it, we're talking about meaningful interaction with their constitution. This is a constitution that was formed 80 years ago under conditions of fear, under conditions of humiliation after World War II. We think it is absolutely unfair that the restrictions of that constitution from 80 years ago are still binding the people if they're in a case that is democratic and they want to do something about that. We think that that's perfectly legitimate on the side of the people. But secondly, under this, we have this idea of the legitimacy of the state. Now, the fundamental basics of any state is to protect its people, right? If they can't do that, their people aren't safe. But we tell you here that regardless of the state's history, regardless of whether we think that is a successful state or not, we believe in that state's ability and ability to improve its ability to protect their citizens. And so we tell you here that we think that Japan as a state should be able to do this. But the problem is that under the current article, they aren't being able to actually use their capacity as a state to protect themselves and their citizens. But beyond that, ladies and gentlemen, and what's most important here is within the context of Japan, we recognize it as a democratic state, but we also recognize it that it is a state whose national identity is founded on values of peace and cooperation. We don't think that the abolition of this would mean Japan now wants to go into war. Rather, militarization means that it can increase its capacity to protect itself and its citizens. If we look at the history of Japan, the traumas that they received after World War II, they're not a nation that wants to go back to that place. And over the past 50 years, we've seen how they've successfully done things like peaceful mediation. But that's becoming a problem the more and more that we look at the context of Japan and the threats that it's currently facing. The conclusion to this principled argument is that it's legitimate and principally desirable for the state to protect itself and its citizens. So let's talk about what abolition actually means. And here we tell you three things in terms of preventing harms that Japan currently faces. 1, it means it can actually respond to the current regional threats that it's facing. 2, it can actually protect its citizens. And 3, it means it can contribute to international peacekeeping efforts. Now, the greatest conflict that we currently find that Japan is facing is the conflict within the South China Sea surrounding the islands that are there. So firstly, we tell you that within these islands, Japan has like 70% of their trade routes occurring there. 80% of their oil is coming from that region. But there's a current threat that is faced by China. Since the 1970s, when they started drilling, China has had more and more of an aggressive stance regarding these islands in the South China Sea. And what we see is that because of this, their presence there is increasing because of the fact that Japan is inadequate in actually defending itself. Let's be clear that I'll take you in a moment, China's incentives are purely economic. But because it's so easy, the fact that they can literally have things like submarines and be monitoring Japan all the time, they're exploiting this position, this disadvantaged position that Japan has put itself in. Yes.
The reason that China hasn't actively attacked any of the Japanese territories is because of the risk posed by the alliance Japan has with the US, an alliance founded on the seas.
Right. We tell you, first of all, this is going to be Alex's matter, that we think that that alliance is further strengthened when Japan has better military capacity. Currently, that alliance is weakening because Japan is just no longer seen as an actor that can meaningfully contribute. But secondly, replying to that POI, we tell you that just because China isn't like actively waging war on Japan, that doesn't mean that it isn't still an imminent threat to them. And this brings me to my second point here, because currently Japan is facing real nuclear threats, not only from China, from North Korea as well. Like, it is ludicrous that countries like North Korea and China are able to pose nuclear threats to Japan within its own territory. North Korea is launching missile tests within Japan's airspace. China has a Hainan military base within that area in the South China Sea, in Japan's territory. We don't think that it is right in any case where a state is so threatened that because it is bound by articles within its constitution, it cannot do anything about that. We think that the people of Japan, in a democratic case where they believe that this is enough of a threat to abolish this act, they should be allowed to do so. They should be allowed to self-determine in that way. Ladies and gentlemen, the only way that Japan is ever going to win this war is if they can enact mechanisms that prevent that war, where they can increase their military capacity. Because what happens here is that the way-ups of their enemies change. We've told you that the only reason these people like China and North Korea are doing these things is because of the disadvantaged position that Japan is in. So when Japan suddenly increases its military effort, its military capacity, countries like China don't actually want to have that cost towards their military. Just last week, we saw how China has stated that they're going to be cutting their military troops by 300,000. Their incentive is purely economic. When Japan increases its military capacity, it means it decreases the threats on the sides of its enemies, because it's now an actor that can actually defend itself. But more than that, we tell you that it can defend its citizens, right? When we saw the case of Kenji Goto, the person who was kidnapped by ISIS, we saw that Japan could do absolutely nothing. And here we say that it's fundamental that a state is equipped and has the ability to protect its citizens when they are facing real and direct threats. We think that this is something that they should be able to do, and the abolition of this article within their constitution allows for that. But lastly, ladies and gentlemen, this allows for meaningful contribution to international peacekeeping efforts. Japan is a country founded on ideals of peace. We've seen how the UN and other countries like the US support the idea of Japan supporting them within these missions. And we think that Japan has the capacity and the interest to do so, because Japan is a country that is obviously going to be affected by any sort of global concern, whether it be terrorism or things like natural disasters. Ladies and gentlemen, what this motion allows is for Japan to use its full capacity, not only to protect itself and its citizens, but to protect the world at large and become a meaningful actor in preventing things like war. We are proud to propose this motion.